are the ideas of beauty similar and different from the Renaissance and 20th century in Western Europe? The ideas of beauty are similar in the Renaissance and 20th century because of body-altering and evolutionary fashion, but differ in gender roles and apparel accessibility. According to Edward Bleberg's book, Art and Humanities Through the Eras, a common body shape of the Renaissance and 20th century was a corset. The corset would tighten the body to the desired shape. Women in the Renaissance would tighten the waist and flatten the bust to create the ideal form. Men would use corsets to shape their upper body. The form of the body would often be exaggerated. The want to enhance the body was influenced by the art style of mannerism. This art style portrayed human bodies as disordered and artificial. In the 20th century, bodies continued to be altered by the continuous use of the corset. The favored look was the S-shaped body. The chest was pushed forward and hips were pushed back, and the small waist continued. In the mid to late 20th century, the shaping of the waist returned, but shoulder padding was added to the clothing. Shoulder padding gave women a feeling of power and the want of rising to an elite position. Cosmetic and plastic surgery was also common in the late 20th century in order to achieve the ideal beauty in both men and women. Evolutionary fashion can also be described as recycled fashion, fashion that has changed slowly throughout time. The gown was an important part in a woman's dressing in the Renaissance. According to Costume and Fashion, A Concise History by James Lever, the gown varied in sleeve length, and usually had fitted shoulders, waist belts, and full skirts, but each style of gown varied for each occasion. The idea of the gown continued throughout the centuries, although changes were made to it. The gown in the 20th century also varied for different occasions. According to the Victoria and Albert Museum, there were evening gowns, tea gowns, morning gowns, gowns for any event. Gowns continued to have full skirts, although sleeves were not as long as before and length varied since women did not have to be as conservative. For men, the vest was a continuous fashion. According to Edward Bleberg's book, Art and Humanities Throughout the Eras, men in the Renaissance wore doublet vests and vest coats. The doublet vest and vest coats became part of the lounge suit in the 1900s. The lounge suit of the 1900s was a sack coat and a vest and white trousers. Vests were also worn with sports jackets or frock coats. Therefore, the idea of beauty was similar in the Renaissance and 20th century because similar clothing styles continued. in the Renaissance lived restricted lives. Women had no political opinions and were controlled by their husbands and their family. In William Shakespeare's The Taming of the Shrew, Petruchio tames Karina in order to create an ideal wife. When you are gentle, you should have one too, and not till then. Petruchio refuses to give Karina a cap because she's not gentle like other women. Women had to be obedient to their husbands, and they also had to do household chores and have children. Men had authority over women and had to choose what their wives would wear to show a man's power and to control the weakness of a woman for the latest fashion. This subjugated women and did not give them a chance to express themselves. Men had more freedom than women. Most men had a place in politics and had the opportunity to study. Therefore, in the Renaissance, the idea of beauty was based on a man's knowledge and the obedience of a woman. Unlike women in the Renaissance, women in the 20th century traded their household chores for machinery. They were encouraged to join the workforce due to World War I and World War II. Men would serve in the war, while women worked on a home front. After the wars, women were usually sent back home to do the household work, but some women were able to take on an official job, such as working in department stores, teachers, and nurses. Men took on their regular jobs as businessmen or civil servants. At the end of World War I, women in Britain were given the right to vote, which led to women expressing their individuality. Men and women took on a natural look at the beginning of the century and mainly wore uniform, but the idea of a strong, tall man was influenced by the war. In the 20th century, the idea of beauty was not based on knowledge or obedience, but was partly based on appearance due to the change in women's and men's roles in society.
The call is sounded and women fall in for service in their country's cause. Khaki uniform replaces the peacetime diversity of fashion, for in the Auxiliary Territorial Service, women undergo military training and undertake tasks which will relieve men for fighting. This is the object of women's enrollment in the services, to enable more men to be spared for the sterner duties of war. The provision of hospital supplies. Here in a famous house, formerly the scene of many a ball or magnificent reception, society women sew and pack, forsaking fashion for white overalls. A modern machine, wielded by expert hand, cuts out 60 garments at a time. Or again at the Royal Hospital, Chelsea, the wife of the governor runs a working party with an old pensioner to fetch and carry for the industrious helpers who are arranged in the hall which Charles II built. Country houses have been turned to similar use. White overall and headdress presenting the distinction of uniform while obliterating all other distinctions. But it's also in the smaller homes of the East End of London and the poorer districts of the big provincial cities that the great bulk of comforts for the troops and supplies for the hospitals are being patiently turned out.
In the Renaissance, the common clothing materials were linen, wool, cotton, velvet, and silk. These materials were not available for all classes. The upper classes could use wool, silk, and velvet, as well as gold and silver threads and jewels. The lower classes were limited to wool and cotton clothing because they were cheaper to produce. In William Shakespeare's The Taming of the Shrew, Petruchio has a tailor make clothing for Karina. Materials were usually bought and given to tailors to make clothing. Most peasants had to make their own clothing. The 20th century encountered 2 world wars and the Great Depression. Clothing had to be rationed due to the Civilian Act of 1941. But although clothing amounts were limited, clothing was more available to people and equally distributed, according to the article, Clothing Rationing in Britain During the Second World War. Due to the Great Depression, synthetic fabrics were created. The creation of synthetic fabrics led to affordable clothing and new clothing lines. Any class was able to afford clothing, and fashion was not limited to a class. New clothing lines such as Dior, Chanel, and more began in the mid-20th century and were easily accessible in department stores. Because of new clothing lines and accessible clothing, New fashion styles were also created and adopted, such as the hippie movement style of bell-bottoms, fringed garments, and headbands, and punk culture in the 1970s, who wore leather jackets, skinny jeans, and heavy-duty Dr. Martens boots. Therefore, apparel accessibility changed the idea of beauty because clothing became widely available in the 20th century, causing the idea of beauty to be based on appearance and fashion preference, rather than the Renaissance, where the idea of beauty was mainly based on knowledge of a man and obedience of wives.